Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Leighton webinar on how the Research and Development Tax Credit can help the medical industry. We're excited to have you all and look forward to providing you with valuable context surrounding the credit today. Also, we will be having a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but by all means, feel free to submit any questions that you might have into the chat as they come up, and we will address them towards the end. So my name is Stephen Latson. I'm one of our R&D Tax Credit consultants with Leighton, based out here in San Francisco, California. While I do have a background in finance, the bulk of my experience has been spent working with a variety of enterprise application companies here in Silicon Valley. At Leighton, my primary focus is to work with our clients to help them identify their credit, confirm their eligibility around their credit, as well as providing any additional resources before introducing them to our technical and tax consultant teams. Ibrahim, feel free to introduce yourself, but as a note, everybody, he is more commonly referred to as Eves in the office. So keep that in mind. If you hear me refer to him as such, that is who I'm talking about.
All right, thanks, Stephen. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you on board and really honored to be presenting this to you. So my name is Ibrahim Ismail. My background is in biomedical engineering. My PhD was in a lot of cell culture and tissue engineering type of activity, focusing a lot more on extracellular matrix components and how that influences growth and assembly. But I won't go into a whole lot of that. But one of my main roles here at Leighton is after Stephen brings clients on, introduces them to the credit, I then come with one of my tax consultants, one of my colleagues, and we'll then start to analyze a company and to see where their qualified activity will come in, which will be a bulk of the discussion today. What type of activities end up qualifying for this credit? Back to you, Stephen.
All right, let's get started. So the purpose of today's webinar, of course, is going to focus on how the Research and Development Tax Credit applies specifically to the medical industry. So first, I'm going to provide some context around the credit, give you a feel on how it began, what the purpose of it is, and how it could help your business or practice. From there, I'm going to pass it back over to Eves, and he will be covering some more of the nitty-gritty details surrounding eligibility in terms of how we go about determining whether or not the projects that you're working on will end up passing the government's requirements. He will then move on to the primary qualifying expenses that we would be including into the calculation of your credit once they're ultimately deemed eligible. We will discuss how this works from an accounting perspective, particularly in terms of how we go about determining which years we're going to include into your credit and how that's going to benefit your business. And then from there, we'll not only provide a few general examples of R&D that we're consistently seeing in the medical space, but we'll also provide a few specific examples that should give you some more insight into what R&D actually entails before covering what our process looks like, how we go about optimizing your credit, and then finally, we'll answer any questions that you might have towards the end. Okay, so the Research and Development Tax Credit is a federal incentive program that rewards companies and medical practices for any process or any product improvements that might be developed at any point in time on U.S. soil. And while many of our clients are initially unaware of its existence, it was actually conceived in the 1980s with the goal of boosting U.S. investment into the hard sciences. Now, with that being said, in its original format, there were some limitations on who could actually claim the credit, in addition to it being somewhat temporary and having to go through a renewal process every 2 years. But luckily, in 2015, the PATH Act was passed, which not only made the R&D credit permanent, but it also added a few other provisions as well, the most notable being that it now allows some companies to reduce their payroll taxes as an addition or a substitution to their income tax liability as well. And what does this mean for your practice or your business? Well, the most obvious outcome is there is an immediate reduction, of course, in your tax liability. And this is regardless of whether the reduction is coming from your income or your payroll taxes. These credits can be kept for up to 20 years into the future, which is helpful if you're, say, a younger company that has been investing heavily into R&D, but maybe you don't necessarily have a large tax liability at this point in time. You'd be able to hold on to those credits for the next 20 years to help offset your tax liability. And since we're also able to look back and amend your 3 most previous tax returns, in many cases, you actually have the ability to receive a cash payment for any credits that you hadn't taken advantage of within those 3 years. So in other words, it can be free money in some cases. But ultimately, the R&D credit really gives you more cash to invest back into your business or your practice so that you can continue to have the financial freedom to keep developing new techniques, new procedures, or any other process improvements that are going to benefit your customers or your patients.
All right, so now to get into the meat and potatoes of the matter, the R&D tax credit is in many ways a activity-based credit. So what it looks at is, instead of taking a financial or an initial financial front of analyzing a company's expenses, it looks at the activities that it performs, looks to qualify different projects, different procedures, different activities that a company might be doing, and then associates or ties specific cost categories to them. So to start, we'll talk about the activities and what's the criteria of qualifying activities that a company does, and then I'll jump into the specific costs that are then associated with them. So the IRS put in their guidance a 4-part test to evaluate any activity that a company does. And to kind of speak on a broader nature, the industry or the company that can be qualified for the credit can be really wide ranging. I mean, you have your giants, you have your Google, you have your Pfizer, you have Pfizer being really big in the news now. You have your very large companies that it's very evident, very clear they're doing R&D, but then you have also many of your startups, some that are in the biotech field, some that are in the medical field, some in the software field, and then some that you might not even think do R&D, and some of them don't perceive themselves that they're doing R&D, such as your local brewery. Anytime a company does activity, does work that satisfies this 4-part test, then they are likely able to qualify and claim this credit. So the first test, the technological in nature test, is really to frame what type of activity is eligible for the credit. And that's basically anything that is rooted in the hard sciences. If the work that's being done is based on the principles of engineering, science, medicine, computer science, chemistry, anything that is hard science, it would then qualify. But if a company satisfies the other 3 tests, but is doing it in a way to optimize their how they process patients, for example, then that's not something that is technical in nature. But even if it does produce business efficiencies, it's not technological in nature. So the first test is to really frame what's being looked at. The second test is to ensure that the activity that's being worked on is new to the business, or it's an improvement upon what already exists. And this is for what's labeled as a business component. And a business component can be any product, any process, any technique, any formula, software, or invention. And the goal in this is that you're trying to seek some type of efficiency, some type of improvement, some type of improvement in the results of what you're doing. So anytime you're creating a new or improved business component, this would satisfy the second test. The third test is called the elimination of uncertainty. And this is to state that there has to be some type of technical uncertainty that exists that a company is trying to eliminate. And this can be uncertainty in the capability of achieving whatever the goal might be, the capability and the method to go about the work to achieving this new or improved business component, or it could be an uncertainty in what the best design is going to be of the end product itself or of the process to go through achieving the goal. So there has to be technical uncertainty that exists at the onset of the activity that you're trying to eliminate. And then the fourth test goes hand in hand with the elimination of uncertainty test, is that you're going through some systematic process, or what's labeled as a process of experimentation and an evaluation of one or more alternatives. So when you're going through this process of eliminating this uncertainty, you'll have certain metrics that you're evaluating your success or failure. Also, failure is a pretty good thing when it comes to the credit. If you're working on a project and it ultimately fails, it means that you were trying something new or improving upon something, you had uncertainty, but then you were ultimately unable to resolve it. And in which case, it is sunk cost for a company, and that's never something that anybody wants to see. But silver lining, you are still eligible to claim the credit on that project. So you have to have some systematic process of testing and evaluating, and there has to be at least one other alternative that you're looking at to see if you'll be able to achieve the goals or not. So now, once the activity qualifies, once we have some project that a company is working on, and we've determined that it qualifies for the R&D tax credit, what type of expenses can we now claim to start actually calculating that dollar amount? And one of the first, and oftentimes one of the largest categories, is the salaries of employees involved in the work. And involvement entails 3 different levels. The people, and the ones you would naturally think of, the ones who are directly doing the work. And then you also get one level of direct support. And this can be, if we take a typical experimental lab or a research lab, it can be people who are washing the beakers and preparing the area, so the ones who are directly doing the work can then come in and do it more efficiently. That would still be considered supportive work. And then you also get a level of direct supervision. So you may not be doing the work yourself, but you are directly involved with the people who are doing the work and discussing the project, discussing the best path forward, discussing different options. That would be direct supervision. So those 3 levels, the salaries of those employees, the W-2 salaries of those employees can then qualify. The percent of their time would then qualify, and that would go into the bucket. Second cost category is subcontractors or 1099s. They're also included. They're taken at a lower rate. They're claimed at 65% of what's qualified. And this is because one of the purposes of the credit is to incentivize W-2 employees instead of just contractors. But there is an expense that is eligible. When it comes to subcontractors, there are some nuances that come into play with how the contract or how the statement of work is designed. Sometimes a company can be eligible, sometimes it cannot be. I had a client that I was working with it was a pharmaceutical client that used many CROs, and about 75% of them qualified and the other 25% did not qualify just because the contract was not in their favor with regards to the credit. So there's a few nuances that come into play when it comes to subcontractors. The next cost category are raw materials and supplies. And this is anything that is used and consumed in the process of development up until and including the first batch or the prototype for what's being done. So say, for example, we don't see this too often, or this limitation too often in the medical field. But I'll use the example of the brewery, since I mentioned that earlier. A company could be developing a new brew, a new batch, and they've gone through their development process. They've gone through their quote unquote R&D, and they get to the point where they need to run a full batch to see if everything's going to come out correct or not based on their previous tests. that is their first batch, and all supplies, including making that batch, can still be qualified. And that would fall under this category. What does not fall under this category is any depreciable assets or anything that can be depreciated. That would not fall under this category and is excluded from the calculation. And then the last cost category, and this, we don't see this too often in the medical field. We do see it in the pharmaceutical realm sometimes, but this is what's called the leasing of computers. Back in the day when the credit was initially instituted in the 80s, to use a computer, you had to rent a room that was filled with a computer, and you had to lease time on it. So those costs can be qualified. Nowadays, this is more so in the shape of AWS, Microsoft Azure, any kind of cloud computing that is necessary to achieve the R&D activity, that's necessary for the computational aspects of the R&D activity. So those are the four cost categories. All those numbers will then go into a bucket, and that is used to calculate the credit. A very rough estimate is about 10% of that total, what's called QREs, qualified research expenditures. Approximately 10% of that is what a company would end up receiving back as the credit. And that is a dollar for dollar reduction of tax liability. So, and this kind of leads into this next slide of how do you benefit from the R&D tax credit. And there's, as Stephen had mentioned earlier, there's two ways that a company can benefit from it, either offsetting income tax liability or payroll tax liability. For income tax, this actually exists on both the federal and some states have their own R&D tax credit. Sometimes the state credit can be as good, if not better, than the federal credit. California is one of those. And then sometimes it's a little bit less, but still it would offset any state taxes that you would have to pay. So it reduces the taxes dollar for dollar. So if you pay $100,000 in taxes and you have $100,000 in credits, you offset $100,000. So it's different than a deduction. It's below the line instead of above the line. You can claim the credit for the current year, naturally, and then this would be an instant offset of whatever taxes you would end up paying instead of looking back. But you can also retroactively look at 3 prior years and amend those years, and to the extent that you paid taxes and you had credits to offset that, you would then receive that as a refund. And this would be, as Stephen was indicating before, cash in hand. The other alternative, and this is eligible for specific companies, mostly startups, is for the payroll tax credit. And this was, again, a federal incentive for startups and young companies. And this is, instead of offsetting income tax, which many of them do not have, they end up being on NOLs for an extended period of time. They can use the credit up to $250,000 to offset any payroll tax that they have, and this occurs on a quarterly basis. There are some restrictions to it. So a company that has to have less than $5 million in revenue per tax year, or in a specific tax year to qualify, and their revenue, they have a 5-year window from when they started receiving or getting a revenue. There is a new legislation that's in play, it's called the Forward Act, that's looking to extend this time period and also extend or increase the limit of what is allowed annually. And that is something we are keeping very close tabs on, because it'll really do wonders for a lot of these companies that end up being in NOLs for an extended period of time. All right, so now for myself, being a techie, the good stuff. What type of activities and what type of work actually qualifies? What can we look at, or what have we seen in our experience? What have we seen to qualify? One of the, and this is of course not comprehensive, but these 5 areas are where we often see eligibility in the medical field. So whenever you are testing, whenever you're developing a new or improving upon an existing surgical technique, that is something that is very good evidence that you will likely, or you can likely qualify for the credit. When you're developing a new formula, fillers, or other materials that are used in your procedures, that is also something, that time and those costs is also something that would fall under this bracket. Developing an entirely new procedure or a new technique to be used within a procedure would also end up qualifying. Developing new acts for existing drugs or materials or using them off-label is also a good indication that that activity or the work that's associated to it or that depends on it can also qualify. And then lastly, just to kind of give a bit of specific example, if you're trying a new technique to reduce scarring, if that's part of a procedure that you're doing, reduce scarring, reduce bruising, or reduce the healing time, that's also something where you're trying to gain efficiencies, and how you're going about it can then, if it satisfies a 4-part test, that's also an area where we typically see a lot of qualified activity. So I have 3 case studies, one in oral surgery or dental oral surgery, one in the IVF field, and then one in clinical trials, as that's something that we can often see related to this industry. Within dentistry, there's actually quite a lot of R&D activity. We actually did an entire webinar exclusively on the dental industry. But just to give an example of something that we see in oral surgery, and it's not exclusively just oral surgery that can qualify, but doing bone and tissue grafts. If a company is, or if a clinic or a practice is already doing bone and tissue grafts, but is trying to find ways of improving it, either getting better bone density, decreasing healing time, or even controlling bleeding during the surgery, these are all things that you're doing to gain some efficiencies, gain improvement in the procedure that you're doing in your process. We've actually seen a few companies do some very innovative work in this front, either using multiple different materials to try and get better results, or pulling out a material to try and get a better result, to gain either less cost on their front, but still achieve the same results or to get better results. A lot of bone reconstruction or jaw reconstruction, we see this as very qualified activity. There's a lot of R&D that can go into that. And then also something that is not looked at a lot, but extraction techniques. We've seen a wide variety, or we've seen companies trying different extraction techniques to make the process easier, to decrease bleeding, to increase efficiencies. They've done a lot to make it better. And that's an area where it can end up qualifying. Now, this bottom table is just to kind of give an example of what we can see as just an example of a company. So a small practice that we've worked on, about 10 employees, they do a lot of R&D activity. A lot of the work is trying new methods, trying new techniques, trying new materials, trying new combinations of materials. They're about 68% of their technical staff was qualified, and about 70 to 90% of their supplies also qualified. By and large, almost all the procedures were experimental, especially the ones that had more expenses. They received about $100,000 in 1 year, and we were able to look back 2 years prior to that because of when they filed their taxes, and they had received a total of $300,000 in credit. There was no state credit eligible for them, so this was just federal for their income tax. Another company which had same owner, but they had about 12 different practices. They had over 100 employees. Only specific projects of what they were doing was experimental, and they would do it across the board among all their practices. So actually it allowed them to qualify a lot more. And they ended up getting about $750,000 across all the entities from between 2 to 4 years, because some entities were newer, some were older. All right, next case study. In IVF clinics, IVF and fertility clinics, Some of the areas that we see a lot of the R&D work is in preservation techniques of the various samples that they work with. This includes preservation, like when you're cryofixing the tissue or the cells, and then also with methods of thawing them to start using them again. Optimizations and the culture conditions, improvements on the blastocyst conversion rate, protocols to decreasing incidence of twin pregnancies. I know it's something that a lot of IVF clinics are looking to get control over, and enhancing viable sperm separation, if that's something a clinic does. Anytime you're doing something new or improving upon a process that you already have, in a substantial way, not small, tiny tweaks here and there, but anytime you're seeking to gain efficiencies and improvements, then it's a high likelihood that that ends up qualifying. We worked with one IVF clinic, a larger company, that had its own R&D department. And when we first started engaging with them, it was just they only thought they could look at what was strictly R&D. They're developing entirely new techniques, new ways of analyzing patient, like, I don't want to get into too many specifics of what they do. They were doing a lot of very typical research and development. And they actually had a lot of published work as well, which is also a very good sign. So they thought it was only going to be that part that qualifies from their business. But as we started expanding and digging in more, there was quite a substantial amount of their other work that ended up qualifying. Now, this is 10% of their employees' time, but across the company, that ended up being a significant amount. So they received about $250,000 in 1 year, and over the past 3 years, they received about the same amount in each year. A smaller company, they were relatively new, so they had a lot more process developments that they were working on, and they had roughly 35% of their employees qualified their time, some lower, some higher, that were very active in their R&D work. They received about $65K in one of their years and about $215K over 3 years. And then last bit, before we start to wrap up, is in your typical pharmaceutical or drug development type of work, or any time a company is doing a form of clinical trials. With clinical trials or with drug development, there's a few areas that qualify that might not seem evident that they would qualify. Aspects when you're developing your protocol to start developing your work or to start going about your process, that's area that you can qualify. A lot of CRO and CRM, contract research organizations or manufacturing organizations, I think I got my acronyms wrong. A lot of that work also can qualify. We end up having to look at the contract, the contractual arrangement between yourselves and that company, but a lot of that can end up qualifying and can be very significant costs. Developing facilities to achieve the goal that you're setting out to. That's also something that it's not typically seen as strict R&D, but that qualifies. It satisfies all 4 tests. It's an area that we see often neglected and not looked at. And then, of course, all phases of clinical trials ends up qualifying basically the entire process. There's actually one other point that I didn't include here, and this is when you're changing and optimizing a step in the manufacturing process. If your company does manufacturing, or you're manufacturing some of your drugs or some of your products, and when you change an ingredient or when you change one component in it, there's a lot of testing that goes into making sure that the end result is still the same. That small change, even though you may not think that you're doing any kind of R&D, but that also qualifies. And then the time that goes into it, the supplies that go into it, all of that can end up qualifying and increasing your credit. To give you an example, and this is one of the industries that can end up qualifying get quite a bit of credit for smaller companies. We have one company that was in clinical trials. They're about 4 years old. About 60% of their employee time qualified. Nearly 100% of their supply is qualified, and about 75% of their contract work qualified. And that's because the other 25%, the contract wasn't in their favor. They received in 1 year $230,000, and because they're a young company, they're able to use that to offset their payroll tax, which held them over for more than a year. So they're able to get quite a bit of benefit from it. A point that I don't think I've mentioned so far, the credit that a company gets, if you're not able to utilize it in a year, it doesn't disappear. It rolls over. For the federal credit, for the income tax credit, it rolls over for 20 years. And for the payroll tax credit, it rolls over indefinitely. So if you're not able to use it in 1 year, or you have, like you're a startup, you're within that 5-year period, bank all of that credit, even if you don't have a large W-2 amount, if you don't have a lot of wages, a lot of payroll tax that you're paying, it's a good time to really start banking that credit. So when you are out of that 5-year window and you're starting to hire more employees to increase your work, you're then quickly able to offset that payroll tax on a very real-time basis. And then just last example, this was a company that was in preclinical trials, still developing their product, still developing their idea. They're about 79% of their employee time qualified. And that's mainly because the CEO and the CFO ended up qualifying at 30% each. So skews it a bit back for them. And then all of their supply costs and surprisingly or thankfully, all of their contract work was in their favor and ended up qualifying. They received about $100,000 in a year. This was including state credit. All right, so that's everything on the R&D tax credit. So as Stephen mentioned in the beginning, both him and I work for a company called Layton. Layton is a global company that we help companies to process the R&D tax credit. The way we typically engage with a client of ours is start off on a high level, determine what potentially is eligible within the company, understand their business structure, and then after that, we start going into a lot more in-depth of their projects, what they're doing, and trying to really parse out and pull out hidden area or potential hidden areas of R&D, or what may or may not qualify if it's not clear. Part of our deliverable is a technical report that outlines all the activity that we've qualified and how it satisfies the 4-part test, along with draft tax forms to actually receive the credit. We don't file taxes, so all we can do is provide draft tax forms and then work with your CPA or whoever files your taxes on getting this process completed. We've typically, for companies that are amending the past tax returns, we've typically seen about a 3 to 5 month period before they receive their refund check. COVID's kind of put everything in backlog, and there's been a lot of it's taken a bit longer for companies to receive their benefit. But for the payroll tax, it starts in the quarter after you file your taxes. So it can be a very immediate benefit. And then just a real quick background on Layton. Layton was founded in 1997 in France. Our founders had the idea, they knew this existed in their company's their country's tax code, and not a lot of companies were utilizing it. And they wanted to be able to bring this to them and help them benefit from this credit. And then it very quickly expanded to 11 different countries, 31 different offices. The US, we started here in 2018, in the start of 2018. And really, we've just found a very large need for it and we've been growing pretty substantially since then. But that's all that I'll mention on that. If you are interested in engaging with us or speaking to us about the R&D tax credit, jump to the next slide. Our contact is here, and you can definitely reach out to us. Please reach out and we'll help you in any way that we can. And at this time, we'll start fielding any questions. There is the Q&A box in the chat. If you can write your question there, it'll be the best way to make sure that we're getting everyone's questions as they come up.
Okay, we do have one. So does it qualify for contract manufacturing companies, those that are working on behalf of other companies?
If I'm understanding this correctly, I'm assuming you're speaking about the company that's doing the manufacturing and they're doing it for another company. Typically, no. We have seen a couple of exceptions. All right, thank you. That was a confirmation. So that's a yes. So typically, no. One of the aspects in the contract agreement is that you have to be owning the research. You have to be the one that's developing it. So if you're doing it on behalf of another company, that typically excludes you from it. We have, like I said, we have seen a few cases where that is not the case, and you're still eligible. But another area where you can be eligible is when you are improving upon your own processes. So even if you're improving upon your processes, and you're doing that while producing for another company, there is a very high eligibility for you to still claim it, because within your own company and within your own expenses, you are then now trying to achieve improvements. I hope that answers the question. If not, please comment again and I'll elaborate.
How significant does a process change have to be to qualify?
So how significant does the process change have to be to qualify? Honestly, we've seen a lot go by and still qualify. We've seen very little bit of change occur, but still end up qualifying. If it's something that is measurable and the intent there was intent of testing, or there was uncertainty that existed, and then you're going about the process of experimentation, you're going about some systematic process of achieving that optimization, then that will still qualify. And I'll give you an example. I don't know if this would qualify or this is relevant for you or not, but say, for example, you are trying to gain efficiencies in cell growth, and you have a specific temperature that you set it at. You want to see if you can get faster growth, so you change the temperature by 1 degree or by 2 degrees. And you'll see if that'll give you better results or not. That is something that is measurable. You have an uncertainty that existed. You don't know what's the best way of achieving better cell growth. And you're doing it through a systematic process of increasing the temperature or decreasing the temperature bit by bit. That ends up qualifying. You're satisfying all 4 tests. It is a small improvement, but it is something that's measurable and it is testable, and you are experimenting with it, in which case it will qualify. The extent of what needs to be changed, this comes a lot in the software industry, where like any kind of debugging or small version improvements, that's stuff that won't end up qualifying. There, it has to be a bit more significant to qualify. My background is not in software, so I hesitate to go into the details of that. We have our own software team that goes through all of those processes. To go back to the question about manufacturing real quick. So to the extent that the client that is supporting, that you're doing the work on behalf of, or then you're manufacturing on behalf of, if they're paying whatever they're paying you to do the work, that would not be qualified. That gets taken out of the calculation. But then any costs that you incur during that process, if it's employee time or otherwise, then that can qualify. In some cases, a company is paid a lump sum, just a flat fee to do the work, in which case you might have significant costs beyond that. And that's where it can start being a lot more in your favor. If you're paid time and materials, it makes it a lot more difficult to qualify.
Okay, next question. So we are a device/reagent company that has been around for more than 5 years. We constantly make new customized probes for clients. Can this kind of trial and error, developing new probes, be eligible?
So the trial and error process of development can qualify, but there has to be a goal that you're trying to achieve. One of the ways that we like to look at it is, what is the hypothesis of behind what you're trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? Or using IRS language, what is the uncertainty that you're trying to resolve? And then to go about resolving it, sometimes the only way to do it is through a process of trial and error, and that is fine. But we do want to make sure that that uncertainty existed prior to it, and then you're doing that trial and error to resolve that uncertainty. Trial and error becomes a finicky part with the IRS. Sometimes they like it, sometimes they don't. But we want to make sure that the uncertainty exists before, or there was a hypothesis or a goal behind what's being done, in which case it qualifies.
Okay, next question. Could veterinarians use the credit also?
And that is yes. I haven't worked with any veterinary clinics yet, but we have seen them across our business. We have seen many of them qualify, and it is an area, again, when you're trying to gain optimizations, gain efficiencies, gain better results, it will qualify. One area that we do hesitate, or we do stop on, and we've seen this a couple of times in the veterinary, or I've heard about this a few times in the veterinary industry, and we've seen it, or I've seen it personally in the dental industry and then otherwise, is when you're doing a strict comparison between two products, two commercially available products. If you're just taking product A and product B and trying to see which gives you better results, that will not qualify. The IRS frowns on that type of R&D. But for example, if you're using product A and then you're modifying the process a little bit, doing it off-label, then that can start to qualify. If it didn't work as is, or you're trying to find a better way of using it, then that becomes experimental, and that is able to qualify. So that's the one caveat, the one thing that we kind of put a little asterisk on it. When you're strictly comparing two commercially available products, that's an area to stay away from qualifying.
Okay, our company started claiming R&D payroll credits 4 years ago, but missed last year's tax credit for 2018. Could we go back and claim one missed year? Is it 5 consecutive years that apply? Last quarter, we filed 2019 income taxes and will apply for 2019 payroll tax this quarter. The only year missed is 2018.
So it does have to be 5 consecutive years. If you missed a year, unfortunately, you can't go back and amend. You can go back and amend and get it as an income tax credit, but not for payroll tax. Payroll tax has to be on a current filing, be it timely or extended, but it has to be on a current filing. So unfortunately, that is the case. The 5-year window, just to also clarify, the 5-year window starts once you start receiving revenue. If you haven't been receiving revenue for 10 years prior to that, that doesn't matter. All those 10 years you can be claiming for the payroll tax And then once you start receiving revenue or gross receipts, then the clock starts and you have a 5-year window from then.
Okay, so following up on the fish reagent trial and error experiments, there is a certain part of the trial that is testing human-derived products that are all reduced down to small fragments from overseas companies. Can we include those R&D costs that we carry out overseas?
Overseas costs are not eligible. Or work that is done overseas is not eligible. It would have to be a U.S. entity that you're paying to, or that is doing the work. One of the few exceptions to this is in the orphan drug tax credit, where aspects that are in the clinical trials, or work that is in the clinical trials that's eligible for the orphan drug tax credit. Any work that's done overseas or outside the U.S. is still eligible to be claimed. You can still claim those costs. Another really nice benefit of the orphan drug tax credit is contract costs are not taken at 65%. They're taken at 100%. And the benefit is actually quite substantially more than the R&D tax credit. R&D tax credit evens out to be about 10% of the total qualified costs, and the orphan drug tax credit is about gets you 25% of your qualified costs. So you get a significant amount more back. But for the R&D tax credit, international work or work outside the US does not qualify, even if it's Canada or Mexico. There's a question on NOLs or carry forward losses. So the question is, if we have carry forward losses, can we still claim the income tax credit? So you can still claim the income tax credit, and then it sits on your books until you're able to utilize, until you no longer have NOLs, and then you start having to pay taxes. Don't hold me on this. I don't know if this is going to be part of the Forward Act that they're looking to institute, or if this is already in play. I think starting 2019 or maybe starting 2020, NOLs can only offset 80% of taxes. The remainder 20% can then be offset by the R&D tax credit or any other tax credit that you are eligible for. But if you have NOLs, the credit, you can still claim it, you can still get it, but it'll just sit on your books until you have taxes to pay.
Okay, I think that's it for now with questions. I guess we'll do a last call real quick in case there's any last minute questions anybody has. Okay, I don't see any more. Oh wait, yes, there's one more question. So we haven't applied for the R&D credit because we have not had much tax liability until recently. How far back can we go to get credit for PR taxes?
We have. So you can only do, for the payroll tax credit, you can only do it for the current year, and then it offsets for the next quarter going forward. So the upcoming tax deadline is coming up in the next quarter. So when you file your taxes, you get the credit, you get the payroll credit based on your expenses in 2020. but then you're utilizing it in 2021. So say you file your taxes in the first quarter, March 31st, you file your taxes, everything goes in, and you claim the payroll tax credit. The total amount, the dollar amount, is based on the activity in 2020. You can't go prior to that, and it only offsets starting April or starting Q2. So whatever payroll tax you would do, whatever payroll tax you owe during that next quarter, during Q2, that would be offset. A lot of payroll providers will either have some offering where you can do it in real time to offset your payroll tax in real time, or they'll reevaluate at the end of the quarter and you'll receive a refund for payroll taxes paid to the extent that you have a credit forward. I hope that answers that question.
Okay, I'll do, oh wait, one more question. So how does the ability to accumulate indefinitely work?
So I don't know how many companies will actually keep their payroll tax, the payroll tax credit rolling forward indefinitely. I mean, so long as you have W-2 employees, you're paying payroll tax, so you'll regularly be chipping away on it. But the way that it works is, say in your 5 years, you've accumulated $250,000 every single year. So you've accumulated $1.25 million in payroll tax. Each of those years, you've only paid $50,000 in payroll tax because your employee count was small. Your total payroll was small. That remainder, that nearly $1 million, is now going to be carried forward year after year after year. And in every year, you're slowly cutting back on it. How that exactly is represented on your taxes, I think each time you file your taxes, you state how much is rolled over from the previous year. But I know the generalities when it comes to the financial aspects of the credit, the specifics of how it looks on your tax returns and so on. I would hesitate to go into details on that front, which is also why we have my financial counterparts. I hope that answered the question. If it did not, please elaborate in the chat.
Okay, we'll do one more last call. Going once, going twice. Okay. If there aren't any more questions, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. We will be sending the presentation to everybody. So if you do want this in the form of recording, it will be made available to you shortly. But thank you all for joining. We really appreciate you spending your time learning more about the R&D credit with us. Really, in summary, it's a great opportunity for you to reclaim some of your tax dollars back from the government. And it enables you to reinvest that money back into your business or your practice so you can continue to improve your processes and keep providing value to your customers over time. But that's it. Please contact us if you have any questions regarding the credit, the eligibility, or how our process works. But we look forward to working with you in the near future and hope you have a wonderful day.
Take care, everyone, and pleasure having you on.